Well, as I have matured, my name is Paul, by the way. I'm one of the co-lead pastors here at Newport. And as I've matured, there are three words that have become kind of quickly my favorite words. And they're words that, I'll be honest, I was a bit ashamed of for a while. I was maybe afraid of them. I kind of avoided them because I didn't want to look foolish or silly. And those three words are, I don't know. Right? Oh, the freedom in those words, I don't know. I tell you, I talk about not having to hide before Jesus. I don't know. And as I've sat with this understanding of these I don't know, I think so much in kind of Western culture, we have kind of this fixation on certainty, right? We want to know the answers. We want to have everything figured out. And so the kind of posture of coming to say, I don't know, is actually really, really freeing. Because it says a couple things. First of all, it says, I can't do this on my own. Like, I need help. I need someone else to help me to know things or to help me to figure out how to fix these things or how to figure these things out. But it also, I think the words I don't know are an invitation into deeper relationship. Now, I think as a pastor, sometimes it's really easy to fall into the trap like I should have all the answers. Or I should be able to tell you everything about God or everything about your story or why everything is happening in your life. And these words, I don't know, are such an invitation for us to be in conversation together, to figure these things out together, to wrestle with these things together. Now, there are certain things that we like to be certain about, right? Like math, right? We like to be certain about math. But then you send your kids to school and they come home and they changed math. Are you kidding me? They changed math. Hey, right? 1 + 1 = 2 still, I think. But like Common Core math is just dramatically different. Right, so we have a son, his name's Bjorn, he's in 2nd grade, he comes home with his math homework. I'm actually really, really grateful that he's learning this because he's like really learning what math means and like how math works. But it's not how I learned math. And so I have to admit, I confess before you, when he brings home his math homework and he's adding 3-digit numbers together, I'm like, I know how to do this. And he's like, Dad, that's wrong. I'm like, I'm certain this is how you add these 3 numbers. Like, I know how to do this work. My certainty is getting in the way because he's learning a different way, right? Something I so admire and is so important to me in our family is the way that Pastor Britta mothers our kids. And her invitation and her willingness, and I actually think it's a really courageous thing to say, I don't know. When Bjorn comes home with his math homework, she says, I don't actually know how this is, but Bjorn, would you be willing to teach me? Would you be willing to help me learn this? And would you be willing to help me figure this out so we can figure this out together? And that posture has invited this relationship now, right? Instead of my being like, I have no idea how you're supposed to do this. This is how you do math, right? There's this relationship that's established with our kids. The way that Pastor Britta mothers our children and models for me what it looks like to come with a posture of saying, I actually don't know, but it's an opportunity for me to reach out and to be in relationship as we figure this thing out together. I know how it works for me, but let's work on this together. And so I've been thinking a lot about this idea of certainty in the context of this morning in the sermon series we're in on the miracles of Jesus. And I've been thinking about how miracles in many senses are kind of an affront to our certainty. Right? The miracles are something that kind of goes against what we know to be certain, what we know to be true. Right? Like, I am certain that a small meal feeds one person. And yet, Jesus feeds 15,000 people. Right? I am certain that storms rage until they run their course, and yet Jesus calms the storm. I am certain that people who are blind don't see. I am certain that people who are lame don't walk. And I am most certainly certain that people who have died do not come back to life. And yet, these certainties, these miracles challenge our way of thinking, right? They invite us into holding these things loosely to ask, I don't know. I don't fully understand what's going on. As a pastor, I don't fully understand. I don't understand fully these miracles or why they happened or who they happened to and why they happened to those people. I don't know. But I think that's an invitation for us into deeper relationship with Jesus. Right? To come and to say, I don't fully know, and to reach out and to touch Jesus and have our certainty kind of brought up to say, I was certain about that thing, but I don't know. And so this morning, as we look at these miracles. We'll actually be looking at a couple different miracles this morning. And the miracles that we're looking at this morning happened at 3 different places in the Bible. And the account we'll look at today comes in the Gospel of Mark. Now, the arc of the story of this kind of trajectory of where these miracles are headed is Jesus has been in a boat with his disciples going from Galilee across the shore. And as he's been going across the shore, these storms have come up and the disciples freak out and he says, shh, and the seas are calmed. And so then as the disciples, they arrive on the opposite shore, they come and they're kind of affronted by this man who's been possessed by demons. That's what I preached on a couple weeks ago. And so Jesus, again, he meets this man and he restores this man to kind of the totality of his wholeness, both physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual healing, right? He meets this man. And so that kind of causes this stirring amongst the people. And so the people of that community, they say, we don't want you here, please leave. And so Jesus gets back in the boat with his disciples and he crosses back over the Sea of Galilee to return to Galilee. And that's where our story picks up this morning. But our story picks up, and there's kind of these 2 miracles that are a part of one another. So the first miracle, as he comes up on shore, he's met by this man named Jairus, and he has a daughter who's deathly ill. And so then kind of as this account is happening, this other miracle happens of Jesus healing a bleeding woman. And so people have kind of called this like a miracle sandwich. Right? There's a miracle kind of on either side that sandwiches this other miracle we're looking at this morning, Jesus healing a bleeding woman. So I suppose you could call this a Miracle Whip story. I do apologize. I shouldn't make dad jokes on Mother's Day, so my apologies. Okay, where were we? So this kind of miracle sandwich. So you have this miracle kind of happening on either side of this miracle of this woman who's bleeding and Jesus healing this one. And these stories are kind of linked together and they're sandwiched together because they kind of inform one another. And so as we're going to go about, we're going to kind of see how both of these miracles inform one another, and they help kind of us to kind of dig into this idea of what is this idea of certainty? And how am I maybe being invited to pay attention to my certainty and to the certainty I have about the way that things go, or my certainty about my understanding? And so as we do this, I'm actually going to invite you into a little bit of a different posture this morning. I'm going to invite you to close your eyes and to just kind of relax your breathing. And as you focus on your breath, I want to just invite you to actually enter into this scene. And so as you breathe in, I invite you to imagine the smells that might be filling your lungs of the sea air. Perhaps the warmth of the sunshine shining on your skin, or the cool breeze coming across the water. As you hear the waves lapping against the shore and the boat scratching against the rocks as the boat is brought back up. And you hear these disciples as they kind of come out of the boat, and as Jesus is coming out of the boat, this crowd begins to gather because so many people have heard about who this Jesus is. So many people have heard about the ways in which Jesus has reached out and has seen them and has known them, and so a large crowd starts to gather. And so as Jesus and his disciples, they kind of start to make their way, this more dignified man, he's a temple official, and he runs before Jesus, and in an undignified posture, he falls at his feet and he cries out, Jesus, Jesus, I need you to come with me. My daughter is so sick. She's on death's door, and I need you to come and to reach out to her and to heal her. And so you're taking in this kind of posture of this undignified posture of this dignified man, and Jesus says, of course, I'll go with you. And so Jesus stands the man up, and they begin to walk through the crowd to follow this man Jairus to his home. And as Jesus is walking through the crowd kind of comes in on every side, bumping against and rubbing his skin and just getting everywhere. The heat is kind of pressing in as all of the people are pressing, and this crowd continued to press in and follow around him. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She'd suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd, and with hand trembling, she touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. And so he turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, she came and fell at his feet, trembling with fear. And she told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." As you are ready, I invite you to open your eyes. As we're invited into this story, to experiencing this dramatic account of what happened to this woman, it seems very apparent a lot of certainties are set up against this woman. That the certainties kind of point to a pretty obvious direction. It says that this woman has been bleeding constantly. The blood flow has not ceased for 12 years. This woman is certainly sick. And it says that this woman, she has gone to doctor after doctor, physician after physician to seek healing, and she has depleted all of her resources. Her financial status is certain. And it says that after she's gone to physician after physician, that's hard to say, physician after physician, she has not gotten any better. In fact, she's only gotten worse. It seems as if her fate is sealed. Certainly, her trajectory is set. Not only this, but she's a woman in a patriarchal society. And so her status, her social standing is getting further and further down the rungs. And so this woman, she finds herself with a certainty of her place. There is no hope. She is certainly going to be overlooked. She is almost as good as dead. Now, this story, it comes in kind of direct contrast to this other story of miracles, because it sets up this contrast against Jairus. Right here, in contrast, you have this well-off man, right? And he has some social status and some social standing. He's a temple official, and so he's well-known, and he's probably got some kind of wealth, because we hear he comes and there's some attendance of his. And so this story sets up this kind of dramatic comparison between these two people. This woman whose status couldn't be any further. Her cause is hopeless. It is certain that her fate is sealed. And at the opposite side, you have this person who is everything, and that his daughter is also facing illness. And so there's an urgency to his story. So certainly Jesus is going to pay attention to this man, and certainly Jesus is going to do everything he can to go and heal Jairus' daughter. And yet, Jesus interrupts the story. Jesus allows himself to be interrupted to see and to reach out and to experience the experience of this woman. Right? It's been obvious. It's certain. Her fate is sealed. It's set. Why would you not pay attention to this man? And Jesus reaches out to her. He sees her story. He hears her suffering. She is healed by Jesus. This thing that seemed so certain is not so certain anymore. This woman's fate is no longer set because she has encountered Jesus. She's reached out to Jesus, and Jesus has in return reached out to her. He's interrupted the story. And so as I've been thinking about this week, I've kind of wondered to myself, why did Jesus do this? Like, why did Jesus allow himself to be interrupted? Why did Jesus take the time to experience this woman and to hear the experience of this woman? I think there's probably a lot of answers to that question. And I don't know for certain, but I do think that at least in part, this story, the way in which Jesus reaches out and he sees the value of this woman, he sees her story, he hears her, he reaches out to her in healing. I think at least in part, this story is there to help us to examine our categories of certainty. Right? We're so certain. We're certain about her story. We're certain about her health. We're certain about her financial status. We're certain about her standing in society. And we're also certain about this man's trajectory and the trajectory of his daughter. And yet, Jesus reaches out and meets both of these women. Both this young girl who we'll find out later has passed away and Jesus raises back to life, and also this woman who's been bleeding for 12 years. He reaches out and hears her story. This isn't a either or, this is a both and kind of thing. And so I think this story is here to help us to kind of start to question and to see how can we identify or start to think about these categories of certainty that we have. Not to set them down entirely, but to ask some questions, to kind of be caught off guard. Well, I was so certain about this thing, and yet Jesus has reached out to this woman. And so I wonder for us this morning, are there categories of certainty that Jesus is inviting us to pay attention to hold open-handedly and to come and ask questions and to say, Jesus, you are in the work of transforming people's lives, and so what is it that you're asking me to see? What perhaps have I been not seeing because I've been stuck in my certainty, or I've been on a trajectory and the line of thinking has created some assumptions. And so instead, what kind of categories of invitation are you offering for me? Because you see, Jesus, he transforms this woman's story. Right? Her trajectory was set, and yet Jesus meets her in her uncertainty and transforms her status. And so this kind of transformation of this certain path, of the certain future, is kind of continuing in the context of this story. You see, this woman's status is also pretty set. Because in those days, for a woman to have experienced this kind of sickness would mean that she would be categorically unclean. She was not allowed to be in relationship to the society. And this is also then kind of further evidenced by the fact that this other girl who dies would also be considered unclean. Jesus comes into proximity of this young girl who dies of Jairus' daughter, and again, Jesus would be in proximity to the unclean. And so there was certainty. There was certainty that Jesus, to be in these experiences, would be to kind of receive this uncleanness, and by association then Jesus becomes unclean. And yet the inverse happens in both of these stories. That is, this woman, she reaches out and she touches Jesus' clothes. Instead of Jesus being contaminated, this woman receives healing. She is made whole. She is released from her suffering. Do you see the difference in these categories? That there was certainty for good reason, right? In Leviticus, there's an outlining of why this happens. Like, you're supposed to be kind of outside the boundary of the society because there are these things that are set. And yet, when Jesus reaches out to this woman, she doesn't contaminate Jesus, but rather she is made whole. She is released from her suffering. And so I think there's an invitation for us to ask this question, well, what does these categories of clean and unclean, what do these look like to begin with? How is Jesus inviting us to see how sometimes the patterns of certainty keep us from seeing the fullness of what Jesus is up to? And so I think what happens in this story is that these categories of clean and unclean, they set up access for this person. Right, we talked about this a couple weeks ago as well, that when a person is unclean, they're kind of isolated from their society, right? They're cut off from their community. And so this woman, she has been sick for 12 years, and she has been isolated from her community. She has been cut off from the people closest to her. And so the other element of this, though, I've been realizing in the context of this story and the pairing of these two miracles, is that this woman's access to God has also been limited. Right? Because for her to be able to access and to be in worship with God, to be in the temple, she had to be ritually clean. She had to go through a process of becoming ritually clean. And this woman has been unable to access the presence of God in the temple. And so there's this healing that happens that when she's healed by reaching out to touch Jesus, there's a healing that's imparted to her, not only in her access to her family and her kin, but also in how she's invited back into the worshiping community. And so I think about, there's this parallel because you have Jairus, who is a temple official who has access to God in the temple. And you have this woman who is certain that she isn't allowed access to the temple because she's unclean. She has no access to this place. Now, in those days in the temple, there were kind of other barriers that are kind of courts that went around in the temple. And so there was a temple, there was a court in the outside called the Court of Gentiles, so a space for people who were non-Jewish to come and to worship Jesus. And then beyond that, there was a temple or a court of women and then a court of men. And then there was kind of the primary temple. And then in the temple where the priests were, there was a Holy of Holies, where they thought the presence of God itself was residing. And that presence of God was kind of partitioned apart by this veil, this piece of fabric, this garment. And so I was thinking about the context of this category of that this woman is most certainly unclean. And so as she's bumping into these people, she's actually contaminating them. She's making them ritually unclean. And it says that she reaches out and she touches the hem of Jesus's cloak. And she reaches out and she touches Jesus. In every other area, her access to God has been limited because she hasn't even been allowed close to the temple. And instead, here, she reaches out and touches the hem of Jesus' the garment, the fabric between herself and God himself. And she reaches out and she touches him. Do you see the contrast between those two things? That in the temple, she hasn't been allowed to be in the temple to have access to God. And here, she's reaching out and touching God himself. This is a dramatic shift in her understanding. This is a dramatic shift in her posture. This is a dramatic shift in the category that she would be considered unclean. And so she reaches out and she touches God himself. And so the third kind of area of transformation I think that happens is what happens in this story that I think Lindsay so beautifully illustrated for us. Is that as she reaches out for God, as she reaches out to touch Jesus, she experiences the healing that she has been longing for. And as she experiences the healing that she has been longing for, she kind of shrinks back into the crowd. And so there's something a little bit peculiar that happens in this story. Just one moment. Jesus pauses. Jesus waits to hear this woman's story. And at first, this can kind of feel a little bit offensive. Like, Jesus, like she has just gone and reached out and you're kind of calling her into question. And so her certainty, she's certain she's going to get in trouble. And so she comes before Jesus. As Jesus reaches out to her, and it can feel like, Jesus, why would you kind of single this woman's story out? Why would you bring her back out of the crowd as she's kind of experienced this healing? Why would you draw attention to her? And so it seems that for her, this category of certainty is that as she comes before Jesus and she falls at his feet, she tells him the whole truth. She confesses. She's laid bare before Jesus. And as she's there in this posture of being kind of vulnerable before Jesus, it can seem like she's going to face being reprimanded because she's broken the regulation. She's gone out, she's reached out to God, she's reached out to touch Jesus, she's sought healing. And so in the process, she's contaminated those she's been around. She should be coming, and the crowd's expectation would be that she is going to face reprimand. And what does Jesus do? Jesus reaches out to her and says, "Daughter." He names this woman. He meets this woman in her experience. He sees this woman, and not only does he heal this woman, but he names her daughter. Now, the word that's used there for daughter is directly tied to kind of kinship, or to being a descendant, a familial connection. And so when Jesus reaches out to this woman, he says, "Daughter, you are part of my kinship. You are part of my family. You belong to me." This is a profound invitation that this woman, who by all accounts was certainly, her fate was sealed, she reaches out, and Jesus reaches out to her and says, "Daughter, you are a part of my family. You belong to me." This is a profound invitation that it is not just a physical healing that this woman receives, but it's a healing, a restoration of her certainty that she belongs to God. And so I want to encourage us as we think about reaching out to Jesus, as we think about some of these categories of certainty, as it we're so certain that this woman's fate is set, and instead of her kind of facing this judgment and her being brought before Jesus and having all of these issues, that instead she reaches out and Jesus reaches out to her and says, "You belong to me." And so I wonder for us, are there ways in which our faith is being invited into reaching out to Jesus? That perhaps we feel like we don't have access to God, or perhaps we feel like our story is being passed over, or perhaps we feel like we have these categories of these things that are set between what is right and how do we reach out and how do we understand God. And so I think there's this invitation that Jesus reaches out to us and says, "You are a beloved child. You belong to me." And that's what we do as we come to the communion table. Is we come to this table to say that we seek to be in relationship with God. That even if we aren't certain about all of who God is, even if we aren't certain about all the things that are happening, that we can trust that our relationship is an invitation to reach out and to say, "Jesus, I need you. I need you to meet me here. I need you to meet me here in the place that I don't understand or I don't know. I need you to meet me here at this table." And so as we prepare to come to this table, would you go to God with me in prayer this morning? Jesus, I recognize that at times we are invited into looking at these places that seem so certain, that certainly we wouldn't be worthy to come to you, or that certainly we are finding ourselves in a place of feeling lost or alone. And God, I pray for the invitation to come and reach out to you. To come and to reach out for the hem of your cloak and to trust that you will meet us there. God, I pray for a faith that would rest in our relationship with you. That you would help us to examine the things that feel perhaps far off, or perhaps feel like they're getting in the way of our having access to you, and that you would break those things down so that we could reach out. Perhaps we don't even feel like we can come to you in front of you, but we can only reach out for the back of your cloak. And so God, I pray that as we come to this table, you would meet us in our uncertainty, in our not knowing, with the certainty that you meet us here, that you love us and that you deeply care for us. And so may we meet you now. We pray this in your holy and powerful name. Amen. As Jesus moves about, he leaves behind him a trail of transformed scenes